This is the In Focus podcast from The Hindu.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the In Focus podcast. I'm your host, G. Sampath. More than 170 people have been killed in violent clashes in Bangladesh. These clashes were due to massive protests by student groups seeking a reform of the country's quota system for government jobs. While this is not the first time students have protested against reservations in Bangladesh, the main bone of contention is a 30% reservation for freedom fighters and their descendants, a quota that the Sheikh Hasina government has always wanted to retain, but which the protesting students oppose. The situation has now somewhat calmed down after a Supreme Court order scrapped this quota. But what was the trigger for the current outbreak of protests and violence? What do they signify for the Sheikh Hasina regime, which has just come back to power for the fourth time? And will Sheikh Hasina publicly apologize for the mass deaths of protesters as the students are demanding right now? We discuss this issue in detail in this episode of In Focus, and we have with us Kallol Bhattacharjee from the Hindu's Delhi bureau. Kallol has been covering the South Asian neighborhood for many years and is the author of several books, including most recently of Nehru's First Recruits, the Diplomats Who Built Independent India's Foreign Policy, and A Singular Spy, The Untold Story of Kumar Narayan, which came out just last week. Kallol, it's wonderful to have you at In Focus. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Sampath, and it's really a great privilege to be on your podcast. Thank you.
Great. So, Kallol, this quota system against which the students in Bangladesh have been protesting, it has been around, I guess, since the early 1970s or thereabouts. So, why are these protests happening now? Can you give us some quick background or overview of what triggered these protests and why?
Well, as you correctly pointed out, that the issue of quota for the freedom fighters or the quota for civil service candidates is actually as old as the history of independent Bangladesh. So therefore, this is not really a new issue that has erupted. However, the intensity of the protest and the equal energy that the crackdown has displayed makes us wonder about what exactly is going on in Bangladesh today, especially in the context of this protest. And my simple explanation to your question is that the anti-quota protest is essentially the symptom to a greater problem that is facing Bangladesh. And the greater problem that is facing Bangladesh is essentially the breakdown of its democratic political system. And this breakdown in the democratic political system was really very well illustrated in the latest election that took place in January 2024, in which Sheikh Hasina returned to power for the fourth term. And the reason that I am describing it as part of an indication for the breakdown in the political system of Bangladesh is that that election was conducted without the participation of the political opposition in Bangladesh. And without the participation of the election of the opposition, the election was held. And as a result, today Bangladesh has an elected parliament which does not possess a single member from the largest opposition party, that is Bangladesh Nationalist Party. And as very famous South Asian politicians once said, that if we don't have representation inside the parliament, then we will be hitting the streets. And this is exactly what is going on today in Bangladesh, that the largest political formations are not inside the parliament opposing the government in a democratic fashion. Rather, they are waging a battle against the government on the streets of the country. And what's happening is that today it is the students, and I will get to the irony of the students fighting Awami League little later in course of our discussion. But for the moment, I would say this much, that today the students are fighting. Tomorrow, there could be, for example, the tailors of Bangladesh or the textile sector workers of Bangladesh who are also demanding decent living standards for themselves and their families. Day after tomorrow, there could be a lawyers' protest, like once upon a time it happened in Pakistan. And in all these protests, it will be the opposition, that is the Bangladesh National Party's huge number of cadre, who will be participating and who will be expressing their disenchantment with the political system. And now one can always blame these movements for giving space to the opposition. But the issue is, if the opposition is not a stakeholder in the existing political system, then they will find space for themselves in whatever public movement comes up. And that is what we are witnessing today on the streets, that the reason that this particular protest is so intense and so focused on, sometimes even they have been attacking the institutions and buildings and structures that are representative or that stand as symbols of Sheikh Hasina's government. For example, they have attacked the infrastructure buildings. They have attacked the metro and rail network. The protesters also attacked the digital economy, the IT sector's headquarters in Dhaka. All these attacks indicate great antipathy towards the leader herself. And that tells us that this is basically a contest for political power between the government and the opposition. And that opposition, which should have been inside the parliament and fighting the government in a democratic manner. But since the space is not given to the opposition, it is participating in these public movements and public disturbances, and thereby making its point.
Right. Thank you so much for this very comprehensive kind of an overview of this protest, Kalul. Now, I'm just wondering, you said that the main opposition party, the Bangladesh Nationalist Party, is not represented in parliament. It boycotted the elections, and you also sort of hinted at the fact that it might be either encouraging or playing an active role in these protests, if I read you right. Now, two questions. One, why did the opposition boycott the elections? Because when there's no point of having an election without an opposition to compete with. And secondly, are the student protests really sort of driven or inspired or in some way inflamed by the opposition forces?
First of all, there is no dialogue between the opposition and the ruling party. And before the election, there was absolute crackdown on the opposition, that is Bangladesh Nationalist Party. And when the crackdown was happening, when the leaders were taken away to jail, and in fact, their biggest leader, perhaps the second biggest leader, because their biggest leader is actually in exile, that is Tariq Rahman, who is highly controversial for his role in various pro-insurgency movement, etc. in 2004 and 5. But then now, of course, he has been out of power for nearly 2 decades, and we don't really know what sort of changes he has undergone. But at least in case of the other leader who is in the country, that is Mirza Fakhrul Alamgir, who was imprisoned in January and December. He was in prison not just till the election, but he remained in prison till March. And it tells us a great deal about the relation between the opposition's top leaders and the government, because they simply have zero dialogue going on. And there had to be a dialogue before the election in which the ruling party, that is the Army League or the government, as well as the opposition, had to sit across the table. And there it was absolutely impossible. And we are aware of several stakeholders, including certain powers from outside the world, tried to bring these two, the ruling party as well as the opposition, to a dialogue table, but that also failed. Those attempts failed. So as a result, there was absolutely no reconciliation between these two wings, and they remained totally antagonistic to each other, like mortal enemies. And the longer this stalemate continues, the higher, the greater is the antipathy and the bitterness between these two big stakeholders for the democratic system of Bangladesh. And at the end of the day, it is the country, it is the state that is suffering.
Right. Right. So coming to this whole quota issue, Kalol, I'm just trying to draw the connection between the larger political crisis you're referring to in terms of the democratic backsliding we've seen with the crackdown on opposition, and this immediate issue at hand, which is this reservations for this freedom fighters group. Now, from the Indian context, what I understand, there are two factors which determine the kind of reservations a country might institute. One, of course, the backwardness of a certain group or a community, and secondly, the proportion or the percentage of this backward group or community in the population, Now, if we consider, as in this case, 30% reservation for descendants of freedom fighters, my question is, are the descendants of freedom fighters a marginalized community that they deserve or they need 30% representation? And secondly, do they constitute 30% of the population as to warrant a quota of 30%? Like, what are your responses to this basic questions?
You see, when we look at reservation in a pluralistic democracy like India, we understand from the point of view of positive discrimination.
Correct.
But when we look at post-colonial states like Bangladesh, where reservation is rather, happening, say, 25 years or 30 years after the first wave of decolonization in the 1940s, what we find is that these countries interpreted the idea of reservation or quota in public services in terms of the immediate struggle that they underwent to create these states. Now, in this particular case, we are talking about creation of Bangladesh in 1971. And immediately after his return to Bangladesh from Karachi, from Western Pakistan, Sheikh Mujibur Rahman decided that these communities, which fought and suffered, for example, the minorities, the intellectuals, the women, who were among the biggest sufferers of the 1971 crackdown by the Pakistan military, and then for example, then the bureaucrats who were dismissed from job earlier, they had suffered so much, and he felt that these are the stakeholders, these are the forces that believed in the idea of Bangladesh. And he felt that those forces, those groups, those individuals who believed in the idea of Bangladesh must find space as Bangladesh's government is formed and as the state building activity starts. Now, as these governments kept on rolling over the years and then came till mid-1990s, when Sheikh Hasina basically debuts as the prime minister in 1996, she then comes up with this idea, this quota should be expanded. And subsequently, then she returns to power multiple times. And as she returns to power multiple times, what is interpreted among the public domain, among the general masses, is that the quota is not just a quota for the welfare of the freedom fighters and their societies, but a code word or kind of an indicator for the creation of an elite, which would then work for perpetuation of the Awami League government forever. Because with every quota comes another bunch of grateful, public service officials. These officials are going to be grateful to the political leadership for the jobs that they have received under the quota. So then it becomes increasingly difficult for a kind of a transparent political formation to survive within the context of the Bangladeshi state, because most of these government servants essentially then become political appointees. And that is one of the major criticism for which the political opposition of Bangladesh, that is the BNP and other forces, are extremely antithetical as far as the quota for for the freedom fighters and their descendants are concerned. First of all, the freedom fighters have mostly now gone to the retirement age. After that, their children have got the benefit up since the mid-1990s. Now, the talk that is doing the rounds is that even the grandchildren of the freedom fighters will get the benefits. Now, that is becoming increasingly difficult because it is appearing as if this is the Sheikh Hasina government wants to create this lobby or an elite core of service officials who would be grateful, who would be beholden to her forever, and then thereby help in perpetuation of the status quo under the leadership of the Awami League. And that is at the core of this political tug of war, that if you create a dedicated or a committed bureaucracy in the garb of this particular quota, then that is no different from any other dictatorship in which committed bureaucracy is basically ordered or asked to deliver a certain positive outcome for the ruling party.
Right, but Kallol, didn't Sheikh Hasina scrap all this quota in 2018 after protests?
Well, what happened was that it was not really a scrapping that she did after due consultation with all the stakeholders. It was more like a scrapping which is more of a message that if the freedom fighters are not to get the quota, then no other group would get the quota's benefits either. Because there was criticism of the quota at that time, and there was a public movement, of course, much milder public movement at that time in 2018. And in response, she had scrapped the entire quota system, which again became effective 2 years from 2020. But then the issue is that this is a continuous debate inside Bangladesh, because once the political system.
Once these quotas went away in 2020, how did they come back again?
Because the High Court gave an order, because there is always a group of freedom fighters who are very keen. So they feel that whenever there is an less representation of the freedom fighters and their family members within the bureaucratic structure, they feel that the balance within the bureaucracy or within the administration is tilting towards people who have less commitment towards the idea of Bangladesh, and perhaps they are more committed towards a slightly Islamized variety of Bangladesh. So there are again these activists who exist inside Awami League, and Awami League is known for being highly secular oriented from its beginning. Secularism oriented from its beginning. So these various interesting individuals, they play their roles in igniting this particular debate from time to time, and this has been going on since 1990s. But in a sense, everyone has come to this point of view that it looks like as if the government is very keen on ensuring 30% quota. And that is the reason that even that sort of criticism in 2018 basically prompted Sheikh Hasina to delete the whole quota option.
Right. And is the judiciary I don't know if you can say this, but is it like, can we assume that the judiciary is independent completely of the executive in Bangladesh? Because the judiciary has played a very important role in the ups and downs of this crisis. Now that the Supreme Court has said 93% of the jobs will be kept for meritorious candidates, only 5% for freedom fighters, and remaining 2% will be distributed among disabled, tribal communities, and so on. So is this going to make the students happy? Is everybody happy now with this kind of judgment being in place?
Well, right now, the judiciary has tried to come in as a rescuer of the political leadership. And therefore, it naturally gives rise to question whether the judiciary is at all free in Bangladesh. And we know there have been multiple cases where the Sheikh Hasina government, in fact, Sheikh Hasina herself has clashed with the judiciary in multiple occasions. And there was a famous Justice Sinha case where justice had to leave Bangladesh, and we all know that the judiciary cannot take a very, very independent line on many matters. But in this particular case, however, the judiciary's intervention has come a bit too late, because now the matter has gone into an extremely charged political platform. And that does not really fall in the domain of the judiciary. Judiciary has given a directive about how the new quota system regime can be implemented. But then the temperature on the ground is so high that it is simply beyond the control of the judiciary. And that is why it is really the need of the day. In fact, today I was talking to a number of these opposition leaders as well as people from within the government. And the kind of rage that both sides have for each other is really not helpful for creating a dialogue. But that is exactly what that is needed right now. Because without a dialogue, this is going to be absolutely certain that there is going to be another showdown very soon between the two sides. So I would say that the judiciary's role is obvious, that it is trying to diffuse the situation, but it is a bit too late. And it is a political contest now. It is a very heated political contest. And that, unfortunately, is really with the two sides who are not at all happy with each other. That is the ruling party as well as the chief opposition, BNP.
Right. So, I mean, Kallol, so this entire democratic backsliding, this tearing of the democratic fabric that you began the discussion with, Now, in this context, where we have seen that you had an election without an opposition, now the opposition is on the streets, so to speak, with the students affronting this entire wave of anger against the Hasina regime. But she came back to power just not too long ago for the fourth consecutive time. So, what does this crisis mean for her? I mean, now the students are demanding a public apology from Sheikh Hasina herself for all these deaths, and they want her to sack the Home Minister and the Road Transport Minister. These are part of their official demands now. So, is she going to accept to it? Is she going to accede to these demands? And if she does not, like, what are the options for the students and for the opposition? How is it likely to play out?
Thank you so much, because you brought up the idea of the students here. Because historically speaking, Bangladesh politics has been driven by student activists. In fact, many ministers who are currently employed with Sheikh Hasina began their careers as student activists in the 1970s and in the 1980s. And Sheikh Hasina herself, when she returned to Bangladesh from the 6 years long exile that she spent mostly in India, depended upon the students and the student activists for her safety. And those are the people today who are at the helm of the affairs. But we really have to ask ourselves this question, that how is it possible that the students' movements, rather the Bangladesh students who have been traditionally pro-Awami League, in fact, going all the way back to 1950s, when the language movement, the provincial autonomy movement of the late 1950s, and the 1960s movement of greater autonomy from West Pakistan, and then finally the freedom movement of 1971. In all these movements, it was the students of Bangladesh who were really on top of the affairs. And today, it is these students who are fighting against the Army League. So we really have to see this great irony, that how is it that today the students have turned against Sheikh Hasina, and this particular situation itself explains something that has gone wrong in Sheikh Hasina's politics. And this is again a great tragedy, because a great many things that Sheikh Hasina did in the last 20 years were absolutely first time happening in Bangladesh and were positive strides. For example, the issue of connectivity inside Bangladesh, the supply of electricity, which really improved rather dramatically. Today, Bangladesh has 24 hours electricity. And then these infrastructure projects, these mega infrastructure projects like the Padma Bridge, and then all sorts of highway building, all these developments have happened in her tenure. And yet, these developments have not bred confidence inside Sheikh Hasina or inside the Awami League. Instead, it has bred this desire to control, or rather centralize many of these responsibilities within a very few top leaders of Army League. That includes Sheikh Hasina and her close family members and a few top ministers in Army League. So here we are finding that a political dispensation that could have gone for a transparent election, because they were, after all, championing things that are positive in the country, have failed to take advantage of those developmental projects that they were implementing throughout the last 15 to 20 years. And here you have, as a result, a situation where the lack of sharing of power with the other stakeholders in the state, like the opposition, to some degree, they even were not engaged in a dialogue. The student community, who are suffering from, say, unemployment, inflation, the laborers of the various labor-intensive sectors of Bangladesh, many of these groups are demanding accommodation, are demanding a hearing from the government, but they have not received that. And this particular movement,
in the context of, sorry to interrupt, in the context of what he said about the good things, the positive things she has done in terms of economic development, infrastructure, and so on. I mean, one thread of analysis about these protests are sort of linking them also to some kind of economic distress, especially to do with unemployment. I mean, is that a big factor in these protests? Is students not getting jobs after their higher education? Is unemployment is an issue is that, of course, I mean, the core issue here, immediate one, is, of course, the quotas for government jobs. And if you are able to generate jobs in different sectors in the private sector, perhaps there may not be such a huge, conflagration over quotas in government jobs. So is unemployment a big issue, all the economic growth aspects notwithstanding?
Yes, unemployment is a major issue because you see, when Sheikh Hasina came to power 2 decades ago, the children of that time are now almost 18 years or 20 years age or 25 years age. And they are demanding jobs today because they have grown up in a system where the transportation system is improving, the connectivity is improving, the basic requirements of life have also been addressed to some degree in Bangladesh, and there are also international studies to cite where the rural sector has been doing better. The health for women and for children, there are these indicators that are proof that Sheikh Hasina government has done certain things that are correct. But then when it comes to handling a crisis, for example, if there is a demand for employment, if there is demand for employment generation, if there are democratic, peaceful protests happening on the streets, as this quota protest, for example, was quite peaceful to begin with, though they were quite noisy. That is, of course, understandable since they are all students. But the way the government talked to them, like, for example, the Prime Minister here herself referred to them quite in an insulting manner, calling them razakars, which basically means traitors, or the people who worked for undermining the idea of Bangladesh. The way she referred to them as razakars was really a kind of a big blow. And it really shows that the government doesn't really have that sagacity to deal with protests. Now, unemployment has always been a problem for Bangladesh, and Sheikh Hasina has been dealing with it to some extent, especially after the COVID. When unemployment became a major issue, the inflation became a major issue. And she has been running from pillar to post also for generating the manufacturing sector jobs. And also recently when she went to China, and then before that she came to India, these issues were also being discussed with other international stakeholders like India. So not that she was, or the government of Bangladesh was unaware of, but then the handling of the crisis in this particular case could have been certainly much
was
more.
she trying to was she sort of trying to sort of provoke them by calling them razakars? I mean, she's a statesman, a very experienced leader. Why would she do something like that? Was that a deliberate attempt to stoke anger, or like what was she as a politician? Why would you use that term when your own students are out on the streets? How does one understand?
Exactly. I mean, these are some of the perhaps the mysteries of Sheikh Hasina's legacy that the world will talk for many years, because it's just simply outstanding. I mean, when we look at Sheikh Hasina's political career, she was in exile for 6 years, and then from 1980-81, when she returned to Bangladesh, from that period onwards till date, she has been synonymous with the politics of Bangladesh. And today, at the end of all these decades, 44 years, she is committing a very basic error, which became an incendiary reason for this massive public protest. Perhaps, sometimes political leaders make these errors, especially in today's time and age, when we have things like social media. And a simple intemperate remark can be amplified enormously and can end up providing ammunition to an already volatile situation. And I think that is what has happened in case of Bangladesh, because Bangladesh student movement and the quota movement has been entirely Facebook driven. And the moment she uttered those words, it appeared as if the political leadership had no sympathy for the 16 and the 18-year-old boys and girls who were standing in the streets of Dhaka and demanding jobs. All that she had to do was, she returned from China very, very in a hurried manner. Obviously, things were made clear to her by the intelligence that she had to return home because there is some sort of a trouble brewing. But then, with one intemperate remark, the entire house was brought down. And I think it really tells us that sometimes even big legendary leaders can also commit very serious mistakes. And this is what has happened in this particular case, unfortunately.
Right, one incendiary remark really making things very difficult for the regime. Now we've discussed this entire, the background and why these protests happen and the larger framework or the context of, this breakdown of democratic kind of processes and institutions in Bangladesh. Now, in this context, what needs to happen for a return to the democratic normal, for opposition to be opposition, for them to be talking to the government in power? What does it say the two or three things that needs to happen before things really cool down and go back to normal, and you can get back to talking about the things, usual things like economic growth and so on and so forth.
Well, thank you, Sampath, for that. What I feel is that, number one, both sides, that is the ruling party as well as the opposition, will have to, first of all, interpret and introspect about what has really happened. And what has happened, especially for Sheikh Hasina, is that it has been completely exposed that the election of January 2024 was an empty election. It was an election, an electoral process, and therefore the victory itself was devoid of public enthusiasm and kind of public support that might have propelled.
Just to interject, if the opposition had been allowed to contest and if they had contested like it was a normal election, would Sheikh Hasina have lost? Was the level of popularity at that level?
Yeah, the opposition's demand was to have a neutral or a caretaker government in Bangladesh before the election was sort of implemented. Election process when started. Now Bangladesh has been known as a case where neutral governments or caretaker governments have been allowed to take power repeatedly. They have done so in 2006, and before that also 1990s. There have been instances where the opposition was kind of they demanded that there should be a neutral government, and therefore they allowed the sort of interim government to take charge and then conduct the election. Now, BNP had demanded that, and Sheikh Hasina said that in 2011, the idea of interim government had been completely negated through the legislative process, and therefore we're not going to bring that process, this particular option back. Now, they did not allow the interim government. Now, the opposition was stuck, therefore, that since they had demanded an interim government and they said they would not go ahead with the election, they would not participate in the election because there is no interim government. So each party is basically stuck with a very orthodox position here. And that is why the election process thereby ended up being what it ended up. That is a non-transparent, non-participatory kind of an election. And as a result, we really do not know. There is no clear evaluation of the public sentiments, whether the people really want Sheikh Hasina or do they want a change. In this sort of a half-baked election, we do not know what is the public sentiment. But now it is appearing that there is definite, at least at the street level, at least the level of muscles, there is a lot of anti-Sheikh Hasina people in the country. And now, so therefore, this interpretation and introspection perhaps will have to take into account that what really is the actual political situation in the country, and then start the next process, which is that there has to be a dialogue with the opposition and then between the government and the opposition. So the civil society, people who are interested in the country, like teachers, intellectuals, and because Bangladesh always boasts of its intellectual class, they will have to reach out to the opposition. They will have to reach out to the government and build bridges between the opposition and the government, without basically creating a kind of a confrontational situation. And thirdly comes the issue of accountability, because before a new beginning, this accountability will have to be fixed. And in this fixing of accountability, will the Prime Minister take some responsibility of what has happened? Because it is, after all, some of her utterings and some of her comments that really added fuel to the fire. Now, or would the Home Minister, would some of the military forces chiefs, would they take the responsibility and step down? And there are very serious demands from the opposition on this count, and they're asking for the Prime Minister to step down and all those things. But now, as of now, we feel that these are maximalist positions that both sides are taking, because the government is very clear and they are calling the opposition as terrorists and nothing else. Because people who attack the public infrastructure, people who destroy the digital infrastructure of Bangladesh can't be called Bangladeshi patriots. That is the government's idea. But at the end of the day, since this is a kind of, such a tough confrontation happening, both sides will have to calm down, and then both sides will have to take stock of the situation in a very objective and totally dispassionate manner that is not possible without the involvement of some civil society members.
Is the civil society free, Kalul, or is there a crackdown on the civil society similar to what you have explained about the opposition being under a clampdown?
Yes, exactly. And I mean, we all know the case of Muhammad Yunus, and because the Bangladesh civil society, very interestingly, organizations like BRAC and others, they have come out and supported the students, but they were very clear that they were supporting the students who were injured, students who got beaten up by the police. In many cases, these civil society organizations like the NGOs and others, they went into the hostels and they gave bandages, they gave medical supplies to the students, and they tried to help them. So the civil society was very cognizant of the fact that the government was cracking down on very, very harmless, innocent students, because these are students, these are not political activists very often, students studying in private universities and things like that. So in such cases, the civil society was actually the flag bearer of decency, that you cannot attack students. In case you are fighting with, say, a political opposition, that's a different matter.
Would you say there is a vibrant civil society space in Bangladesh as of now?
Yes, there is, of course, a very huge civil society space, and many of them have been quite vocal in Facebook and gently criticizing the government, because they know that they will have to handle such an angry government in a very careful manner. But then there are also sections of the civil society that have already come out in a very strong way against Sheikh Hasina. And for example, Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel laureate, has already asked for global condemnation for Sheikh Hasina. But then there are also others who want to walk the middle path and ensure that the government and the opposition remains in contact with each other, so that the common public, the general public, can avoid the suffering and the disturbance and disruption of their daily activities. Because for a not even a middle income economy, these sort of disturbances and destruction is highly distressing. So I think the civil society is trying to avoid that.
Right. Thank you so much, Kalul. I'm sorry we have completely run out of time. I mean, 3 big points towards the end. One, of course, both sides must introspect on the recent events. Secondly, civil society must reach out both to the government and to the opposition. And thirdly, there has to be a show of accountability, especially in the way the students have been treated by the police and government forces and the kind of casualties that have resulted. Thank you so much once again, Kalul, for sharing your insights and observations on this developing story. Pleasure talking to you.
Thank you so much, Sampath. It's a privilege talking to you, Sampath. Thank you.
In Focus will be back soon with analysis of the biggest news issues. In the meantime, you can find our podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and other platforms. Just search for In Focus by The Hindu. We'll see you soon.